A good Erev Shabbos and Chodesh Tov. Let's appreciate for just a moment exactly where we are in the world and in history and in our own lives as a community, especially in light of this moment, especially in light of the past few years. We are marking and celebrating Rosh Chodesh Iyar, Friday and Shabbos. We're bracing ourselves on Tuesday to mark Yom HaZikaron, the day that Israelis and hopefully Jews all around the world pause to recall the soldiers who died defending the Jewish people and the Jewish land in the Israel Defense Forces. That will take us right into Yom Atzma'ut, Wednesday, marking this year the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, proclaimed on the eve of the 5th of Iyar, 5708, 1948. And this week, by divine providence, we are reading the Parshios of Tazria and Metzora together. Together and together. The Parshas are both read together on the same Shabbos, and we are together as a community. It means we're studying and listening to them, and we read them as a kehillah, in no small part because we require a minyan, and by extension a community, for public Torah reading. Now, in reverse order, let's reflect on each of those points. Parshas Tazria and Metzora present their own challenges. For anyone who had to prepare a Devar Torah in the last week or so, for rabbis preparing drushes, for Parsha study groups, these Parshas elaborations of tzoraas, some kind of malady that we can't even agree on an English translation for, and its resultant contamination of persons and clothing and houses that devolve from it, and the attendant isolation and quarantine that the Torah mandates. It's not something readily or easily understood or empathized with to us moderns, or at least it wasn't in 2019, 4 years ago. For fun, I took a peek back in the archives to April of 2019 to see what it was that we discussed in connection with these Parshas, Tazria and Metzora. You know what? I took the easy road. I sidestepped both Parshas, which were read that year on separate Shabbosos, didn't mention either of them. In 2019, in the spring, the Canadian Haggadah had just been published. So we discussed that on Shabbos Tazria, and mercifully, Shabbos Metzora, it was Shabbos Haggadol. It was a leap year that year, so we talked about the Seder, we talked about the deeper meaning of matzah. No mention of Tazria and Metzora really at all. I know we're all trying to forget it, but in April of 2020, a year later, our worldview had shifted considerably. Our frame of reference was quite different. That year, we read Tazria and Metzora conjoined, or we would have read them conjoined, as on this Shabbos this year, if in fact we had gathered in Shul for a minyan. In April of 2020, there was no minyan in Shul. There was no Kiddush. There was no public Torah reading. The Shul was locked. The alarm was on around the clock. And we were all sitting in isolation and quarantine and confinement, fearing the unknown contamination and contagion that the pandemic dropped at our doorstep, if only we could keep it at the doorstep. It was a time of great anxiety and fear. And when we opened these Parshas again in the spring of 2020, having just spent the Sedarim and the whole of Pesach alone, isolated, we had a lot of new insight into these Parshas' discussion of transmissibility and contamination and isolation and quarantine. Now, hopefully, we've crossed that sea and we've come out, most of us, safely on the other side, not too much worse for the wear, but no doubt traumatized. We can look back and appreciate what we suddenly had great insight into, all that these Parshas were telling us, but it took our experience at that time, sitting in our own hezger, our own individual quarantines, maybe to appreciate the wisdom and insight of those seemingly mysterious and obscure Parshas. Last year, Aviva Zornberg came out with a new book of studies, this time in the book of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra. It's titled The Hidden Order of Intimacy. And in fact, relationships and intimacies are one of the pillars of her reflections on this part of the Torah. On this week's double portion, Tazria and Metzora, Zornberg writes about the performative power of speech. Tzoras, this existential condition whose etiology may well be in speaking ill of one another and has symptoms that first present on a person's skin, only has its effect when a Kohen pronounces the person as Tameh. Without that pronouncement, the person's status does not change, no matter what symptoms they may be showing. There's a conversation in the Gemara in Moed Katan as to whether it's advisable or not to allow the Kohen to make the pronouncement on Yom Tov or Chol HaMoed, because the person's quarantine may restrict them from celebrating the festival with the community. But it's the Kohen speaking these words that the Metzora is now Tameh that makes that status take effect. She calls this the performative power of language. Performative power of language enacted in this moment. The words make it real, quite literally. The status of the person afflicted with tzoras becomes a reality only when the Kohen verbalizes, says the words. Then, once diagnosed or so pronounced, the Metzora himself calls out Tameh, Tameh, which may be a warning to others to avoid contact, contamination. Might be an acceptance of his own condition, and also might be asking other people to have rachmanas on him, to daven for him, that he be healed. Zornberg makes reference to mirror neurons, this part of brain research that suggests that when we witness others suffering, we suffer as a result, and we wish, we pray, maybe even work for the suffering of everyone in the equation to end. But whether or not this theory holds up, she writes, the cry of the sufferer interrupts, appeals, demands. The one who hears him must ask for compassion. This is an ethical moment. The moment assumes the reality of compassion, meaning suffering with the other who is apart from him. Now let's take that idea and connect it to Yom HaZikaron. Tuesday at 11 a.m. in Israel, the siren will sound and everything will stop. People will stop driving and get out of their cars to stand next to them in the roadway. People walking and working and teaching and studying will stop and stand, and it will be silent for 2 minutes. People will be alone together with their thoughts, their memories of friends, siblings, parents, children who have died in Israel's wars and in terrorist attacks. Every family in Israel has someone or knows someone who fell, so the entire country holds that place of remembrance and grief for that moment in time. Here outside of Israel, many of us know people or know people who know people. Maybe to have compassion, as we just said, compassion, to endure the suffering with someone, even though they're a different person than me, and their experience is different, is what the cry of that siren calls us to. Now, with regard to cries and silence, some of us just studied this week the story of the martyrdom of Rabbi Ishmael, who was executed in a most horrible way by the Romans. He cried out in great pain and anguish, and then he cried out again. The Talmud records that God told Rabbi Ishmael at this point, if you cry out again, I will allow the world to revert to its primordial chaos. We were reading an essay, studying an essay on Rabbi Ishmael by Eli Wiesel, and the printed text says that Rabbi Ishmael did not cry out, because the world is still here. We were able to hear a recording of this talk when it was presented in public 40 years ago, and Professor Wiesel said, parenthetically, sort of as an aside, or perhaps he did cry out, have you seen the world lately? From this incident, perhaps, we can draw some insight into silence and also into crying out. Both are important and both have their place. And as a cry can be a call for empathy, as we said with the Metzora in Aviva Zornberg's explanation, and as it can bring us to compassion with others who are enduring suffering, we see from this story of Rabbi Ishmael that cries can also become destructive at a certain point. This week will mark the 75th anniversary of Israel's independence. For those of you just tuning in, let's recall that this is the first time that Jews have had sovereignty over the land of Israel in 19 centuries. It's been a while. Let's also acknowledge the mixed feelings that some people are expressing in Israel and out of Israel at the current government and some of its ministers and policies. I can certainly sympathize, as every country I have ever lived in had a less than perfect government. And I think many of the people in our shul have had similar experiences. Let's remember the words of Churchill when he was voted out of office after World War II, and when Tony returns, he will surely do it more justice. Churchill said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have ever been tried." Let's not let the classic and ever-present Jewish expectation and hope for a better world and better leadership get in the way of our acknowledgement and appreciation of what we have. We are living at a time with a lot of blessings, as we're now coming to the last part of the first century of restored Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel. It is not perfect. It is not all-inclusive as it might be. It is not as egalitarian as it wants to be. It is not yet safe from its enemies and those who would wish it harm or worse. Saddest of all, in my humble opinion, it does not enjoy the full and full-hearted support and enthusiasm of all the Jewish people around the world. Whatever flaws you may be able to point out, whatever swings of the political pendulum, it is a state of being that none of our grandparents probably could have dreamed of. They may have prayed for it, they may have worked for it, but it is unlikely that this situation was even within the reach of their dreams. So let's cry out when it's appropriate, and let's take inspiration from Rabbi Ishmael's silence when that's appropriate, lest our cries unleash chaos on the world. We like to tell ourselves that we're right on the brink of chaos, but we're not. B'li ayin hara, we are good, and we have a lot of potential to get so much better. The sympathy and compassion that this parsha encourages us to show the Metzora, even though, according to some views, he may have brought this condition upon himself, might inspire us to more sympathy, more compassion, and fraternity with those of us who live in Israel. At any rate, we appreciate and we acknowledge the sacrifice made in blood by so many families, so many parents of their children, of the soldiers and defenders of our people. This coming week for Yom HaZikaron and the following day, Yom HaAtzma'ut, may we all merit to be appreciative of all that we have been given, all that we have, and may we all find the words and the silences to express that gratitude. A good Shabbos, Chodesh Tov.